Hey everyone, today we are looking into Lady Godiva, an English noblewoman who lived during the period of turmoil in England, prior to and during the Norman conquest of 1066. During her life, she was a notable patron of religious establishments, but she is best remembered for a certain legend which tells of her riding naked through the English town of Coventry. But was this true? And who was the real Lady Godiva? Lady Godiva was probably born around the year 1000 or very shortly thereafter, though sources vary. The name of her parents are unknown, but she was known to have been the sister of Thorold of Buckenhall, the Sheriff of Lincolnshire. Godiva is the most commonly used variant of her name, but she was also known widely as Godgivu or Godgif, and there are at least 17 different spelling variations of her name in sources of the time. At some time in her youth, perhaps around 1020, she married Leofric, who was in line to the earldom of Mercia, one of the most powerful earldoms in pre-Norman England, along with Northumbria, East Anglia and Wessex. Leofric eventually became Earl around 1032, making him Britain's most powerful man behind the Earl of Wessex, Godwin, and of course Canute the Great, King of England, Denmark and Norway. Lady Godiva and Leofric had one known child, called Elfgar. They also lived in comfort and had various estates such as one at King's Bromley in Staffordshire. The pair also might have lived at Coventry for some considerable period of time, where the Earls of Mercia had long had a villa or castle of some kind. However, there was no real town so to speak of at Coventry in the 11th century. An old Saxon nunnery had been there in the early Middle Ages, but it had long since been abandoned, and during Leofric and Godiva's time, they gave this abandoned land to a group of Benedictine monks to establish a monastery on. In time, a small service village grew up around the monastery, and this became a small market town in the course of the 12th and 13th centuries. So, Godiva was intimately connected with the establishment of Coventry town, but most would agree that it didn't really exist in her own time, and this is important when considering the legend about her. Despite Lady Godiva being a real person with a real story, sometimes there are certain people in history around which curious legends develop, and this can make it difficult to separate fact from fiction. This is especially the case with figures from ancient and medieval history, for whom our sources are often more fragmented or based on chronicles of dubious veracity. So, what is the legend of Lady Godiva? Why has it intrigued us for hundreds of years? Was any of it real or based on genuine historical facts? And how did this noblewoman, who lived over 1000 years ago, become the subject of such a tale? The legend of Lady Godiva is fairly simple on the surface of it. One day in the 11th century, Lady Godiva came riding through the streets of the town of Coventry on a horse. So far so normal, one thinks. Except, Lady Godiva was naked, apart from her long hair which fell down over her. According to the legend, Godiva had elected to take this course of action in protest against her husband's oppressive taxes, which the people of Coventry and the surrounding area could not afford to pay. She had allegedly argued with her husband on several occasions to try and get him to reduce the taxes and have mercy on the common people. He had stubbornly refused at each attempt, though on one occasion, perhaps in a joking manner, he said that he would lower the taxes once she rode through the streets of Coventry naked. Godiva had the last laugh. She had a directive issued to the townspeople of Coventry that on the day in question, everyone was to stay in their homes and shutter up all of their windows and doors so that nobody could actually see her. So, when she rode through the streets of Coventry naked that day, the idea was that she was fulfilling her husband's requirement in order to get him to lower the taxes. But no one would ever have seen her, except one person did. A local tailor by the name of Tom disobeyed the proclamation to remain at home and to not look outside at any point. Consequently, he was the only person in Coventry that day who actually laid eyes on the naked Lady Godiva riding through the streets. As a result, so the legend goes, Tom was struck either deaf or blind, and the story is the origin of the term peeping Tom, as a description of a voyeur. So the legend is fairly straightforward, and one would assume that having fulfilled her side of the bargain, Lady Godiva went to her husband and demanded that he now meet his end of the deal and reduce the taxes due from the people of Coventry and the surrounding region. Everyone was happy, except from poor Tom, who was either deaf or blind now, depending on which version of the legend one reads. The story became so popular in later years that in the town of Coventry today, there is a statue of Lady Godiva on her horse, which was made by the artist Sir William Reid Dick, and which was placed there in 1949. So, was there any truth to the legend? Well, most modern scholars doubt this ride ever took place. However, there is one event which may have given rise to something similar to the events of the legend. In the year 1041, the King of England and Denmark, Harthacnut, ordered Leofric along with other earls to plunder and burn the city of Worcester, in response to the murder of 2 tax collectors by angry locals who were being heavily taxed. Leofric duly carried out his king's orders, and Worcester was laid to waste. Because of this horrific act committed against his own people, there is a possibility that Godiva rode through the small hamlet of Coventry as an act of contrition concerning her husband's horrendous actions. Although Coventry wasn't very well established at this time, as previously noted, the Domesday Book lists the farming village as having 69 families in the year 1086, so perhaps there was a reasonable population during Godiva's life. Thus there is a chance that the riot did occur, though this would have been very different to the version of events from the popularized legend. During her life, Lady Godiva was significant as a benefactress of religious houses, like that which was established at Coventry by her and Leofric for the Benedictines. As early as the mid-1020s, when she was still young, she bequeathed lands in Barking in Suffolk to the Bishop of Elmham and Dunwich, Aelfric, and the Abbot of Ely, also called Leofric. This was perhaps also for the establishment of a religious house which Godiva wished to be founded, as she was seriously ill in the mid-1020s and believed she would die. She did not, and having recovered, she continued her patronage of the church, as well as granting the Benedictines land to establish their monastery at Coventry. She also gave the monks there several valuable gold and silver items for the church, including a silver necklace valued at 100 marks, a very substantial sum of money in the 11th century. This was not the only gift of valuable items she made to religious institutions, and others included a gold-fringed chasuble or liturgical vestment, which was donated to St. Paul's Cathedral in London. There are numerous other donations which could also have been noted. Unfortunately though, this pious charity on the part of Lady Godiva and her husband Leofric would only benefit these churches and religious houses for a small period of time. When the Normans arrived in England in 1066 to conquer the country from its Anglo-Saxon and Danish rulers, they systematically stripped the country of its wealth in the 5 years that followed. Many of the items which Godiva and Leofric would have given to these institutions years earlier were probably requisitioned by one Norman knight or another, as churches and monasteries up and down the country were being looted during the conquest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a major chronicle of early medieval England, records very precisely that Leofric died on the 30th of September 1057, so he would not have lived to see the normal conquest. But Lady Godiva did. The Domesday Book, a record which the Normans produced of every landowner in England in 1086, makes it clear that she was still alive at the time of the initial conquest. It also seems to suggest that she managed to retain possession of some of her and her husband's estates after the conquest, which is quite remarkable if it is the case, as the Normans conducted a vicious land grab in the late 1060s and 1070s, which saw nearly every major Anglo-Saxon or Danish landholder in the country dispossessed. However, the Domesday Book also makes it clear that she had passed away by the time it was composed in 1086, indicating that she died at some unknown time between 1066 and 1086, although some sources state she died in 1067. She was buried next to her husband in St Mary's Priory and Cathedral in Coventry, which she and her husband had patronised the establishment of several years earlier. It's believed that at the time of her death, she was among the richest women in England, while her estates were valued at £160 of silver. Yet, all her wealth and lands were forfeited to the new King William at the time of her death. This radically different version of the historical Lady Godiva from the legendary version of Godiva does leave one asking, where did the legend come from? The answer would seem to be that it comes from a great many different sources, and what started off as a small fable was gradually embellished over time. The origins of the legend can be traced back to the 13th century, when a certain Roger of Wendover composed his Flores Historiarum, meaning flowers of history. Roger was a somewhat gullible collector of fables, who recorded a story about Lady Godiva riding through Coventry naked, attended by two knights. There was, though, no mention of the peeping Tom at this point. The story had probably arisen at this time as some form of acknowledgement that Godiva and her husband Leofric were effectively the founders of what became the town of Coventry. Historians have also discerned that the story of Godiva's nudity may have reflected a popular pagan fertility tale which was here being absorbed into Christian storytelling. Move forward 300 or so years, and we find a new writer by the name of Richard Grafton, also writing about the legend. Grafton was a member of Parliament for Coventry, and also a pious Protestant. He was accordingly inclined to remove some of the impropriety from the story when he wrote about it in his Chronicle of England in 1569. As a result, it was Grafton who added the details about Lady Godiva, insisting that the townspeople be instructed to stay in their homes and shutter up their windows and doors. Now, the story was being retained, but Grafton had removed the immorality from it, ensuring that a plot device was inserted which meant nobody actually saw Godiva naked. There was still no peeping Tom in the story at this point. Indeed, the unfortunate Tom did not appear in versions of the legend until the 18th century. It was certainly not a part of the legend when William Dugdale wrote an extensive account of Coventry in the mid-17th century. But suddenly, in the 18th century, numerous versions of the legend appeared in print, which added in the story of Tom, his prying eyes, and his subsequent blindness or deafness. The concept of this character was probably one that had arisen independently in Coventry lore, and was added to the legend in the early 18th century. Thus, as early as 1732, there is a local history which includes the story of him spying on Godiva, and several further references thereafter in the decades that followed. Some suggest that, rather than being miraculously struck blind or deaf by some almost supernatural-like affliction, what happened was that Tom actually had his eyes put out by the townspeople when they learned that he had disobeyed Godiva's command. Thus, the legend of Lady Godiva and her naked horse riding through the town of Coventry was likely a myth, though its basis was rooted in the historical Lady Godiva and her husband Leofric. The legend was added to substantially at various times in the centuries that followed, making it even more spectacular and unrealistic. The real Lady Godiva, somewhat less astonishingly, was a notable benefactress of religious houses and churches throughout England in the mid-11th century. She lived through the Norman conquest of 1066 and possibly the years after, and sadly her later years would have been spent watching a conquering class of Norman knights and warriors overthrowing the very society she and her husband had patronised. In the 17th century, Coventry began to hold an annual event in her honour, the Godiva procession. This reenacted her story and legend, but in the 20th century, it was replaced by the Coventry Carnival. Fortunately though, in recent years, the Godiva procession was revived and combined with the Coventry Carnival to become the Godiva Carnival Procession, which is associated with the 3-day Godiva festival held in Coventry's War Memorial Park. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Lady Godiva and her legend. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you thought of the legend down in the comments and if you thought it was real or maybe in part real. If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them in the comments, and I hope you guys have notifications turned on so you get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.